There is a question your soulmate may have been able to avoid for a long time until someone unexpectedly placed it directly in front of them. If they were standing right here, right now, what would you say to them? And something about that question may have changed the atmosphere immediately, because it is easy to think about someone when they are far away. It is easy to replay memories, imagine conversations, or tell yourself what you would do if they ever came back. But imagining you actually standing there is completely different. Suddenly there is no distance to hide behind, no message to rewrite, and no time to carefully choose the perfect words. They have to imagine looking directly at you and allowing everything they have kept unspoken to exist between you again. Perhaps they paused before answering. Perhaps they laughed nervously, became unusually quiet, or tried to change the subject. Sometimes the reaction before the answer reveals what the heart is struggling to organize. Because the question wasn't really asking them what they would say. It was asking them what they would finally be willing to admit. Maybe they immediately remembered something they never apologized for. Maybe a conversation came back to them that ended without the truth being spoken. Maybe they suddenly wondered whether you would even want to hear from them anymore. And somewhere beneath all those thoughts is a much deeper realization. If you were truly standing in front of them, they could no longer pretend the past doesn't affect them. They would have to face the person behind all those memories, the person they once knew, the person they may have misunderstood, and perhaps the person they still haven't completely let go of. And the most revealing part may not be what they said when they were asked the question. It may be what they almost said before they had time to protect themselves. Now that the question has been asked, your soulmate may be left with something they have been carrying for much longer than they ever admitted. It may not be one dramatic confession or one perfect sentence. It may be a collection of words that never found the right moment to come out. Because when someone asks what you would say to a person who is standing directly in front of you, the mind doesn't always go to the obvious answer. It goes to the unfinished conversations, the moments where you wanted to explain yourself but didn't, the apology you thought about giving but kept postponing, the sentence you almost sent in a message and then deleted, the truth you felt but couldn't find the courage to say when the opportunity was actually there. Your soulmate may suddenly be remembering all of those moments now. They may realize that there were things they wanted you to understand, but instead of saying them, they chose silence, distance, pride, or simply waited for a better moment that never arrived. And perhaps that is why the question affected them more than they expected, because imagining you standing there makes those unfinished words feel real again. They can no longer hide behind the excuse that there was plenty of time. They can no longer tell themselves that eventually everything would somehow be explained. There is something powerful about an unfinished conversation. It stays open in the mind because there is no final sentence to close it. Your soulmate may have replayed certain moments many times, wondering what would have happened if they had said something different. What if they had been more honest? What if they had admitted they cared? What if they had asked you to stay instead of allowing the distance to grow? What if they had told you what they were actually feeling instead of expecting you to understand it without words? These questions can become especially powerful when someone suddenly asks them to imagine you standing right in front of them. Because now they have to decide which of those unsaid things would actually matter enough to speak. Maybe they would begin with an apology. Maybe they would say they are sorry for the way certain things unfolded. Maybe they would admit that they didn't understand the situation clearly at the time. Maybe they would tell you that they were dealing with emotions they didn't know how to handle. Or perhaps the first thing they would want to say is something much simpler. I still remember you. Not necessarily because they want to recreate the past, but because some memories never became meaningless just because time passed. Your soulmate may be realizing that the words they want to say aren't really about changing history. They are about finally acknowledging it. There is a difference between wanting someone back and wanting them to know the truth. Sometimes a person doesn't know whether the relationship can ever return to what it was, but they still wish they could correct the misunderstanding, explain the silence, or acknowledge the impact the connection had on them. Your soulmate may be somewhere inside that uncertainty right now. They may not know what would happen if they actually saw you again, but they are beginning to understand what they would want you to know. And perhaps they are remembering how many times you tried to understand them when they weren't making it easy. Maybe you gave them opportunities to speak. Maybe you waited for them to open up. Maybe you sensed something they couldn't admit. And now, looking back, they may realize that you were offering emotional space they didn't know how to use. That realization can create regret, because people often recognize the value of emotional safety after they no longer have easy access to it. Your soulmate may be wondering whether you would still give them that same space today. Would you listen? Would you believe them? Would you understand what they are trying to say? Or would you simply look at them and realize that the moment has already passed? That uncertainty may be the hardest part, because they can imagine the words, but they cannot control how you would receive them. They can rehearse an apology, but they cannot rewrite the past. They can imagine telling you that they cared, but they cannot force you to believe that their actions match those feelings. And perhaps this is where the question begins to change them. What started as an innocent question about what they would say to you becomes a confrontation with everything they left unsaid. They may begin to understand that the real reason they have so much difficulty imagining the conversation is because they know there are things you deserve to hear. Not because they are guaranteed another chance, but because you may have walked away from the connection carrying questions they never answered. And now, for the first time, they may be asking themselves whether silence protected them or simply delayed a truth they were eventually going to have to face. The answer may be becoming clearer. They may not be ready to say everything aloud yet, but the question has already opened something inside them. And once those old words start coming back, another realization begins to surface. They aren't only thinking about what they would say to you. They are remembering exactly what it felt like to have you there, and that may be the part they have missed far more than they ever admitted. And now the question may be taking your soulmate somewhere much deeper than they expected, because they are no longer thinking only about the words they would say to you. They are beginning to remember what it actually felt like to have you in their life. When someone is asked to imagine a person standing directly in front of them, the mind doesn't always begin with a conversation. Sometimes it begins with a feeling. They may suddenly remember your presence before they remember your words. The way you made ordinary moments feel different. The comfort of knowing there was someone who understood certain parts of them without requiring a long explanation. The little conversations that seemed insignificant at the time may suddenly feel more meaningful, because they now understand that those moments were part of a life they cannot simply recreate whenever they want. Your soulmate may be realizing that what they miss isn't necessarily one particular event. They may miss the emotional atmosphere that existed when you were around them. They may remember how easily you could make them laugh, how you noticed changes in their mood, how you listened when they needed someone, or how your presence could make a difficult day feel slightly easier. And perhaps they never understood how much those small experiences mattered until they were no longer part of their everyday reality. It is strange how absence can make ordinary things visible. When someone is constantly present, you may not consciously notice the sound of their voice, the way they react to certain situations, or the small comfort created simply by knowing they are there. But once that person is gone, those details can become some of the strongest memories. Your soulmate may be experiencing that now. The question has opened a door, and behind it they are finding pieces of the connection they thought they had already put away. Maybe they remember sitting beside you during a quiet moment when neither of you needed to say anything. Maybe they remember a random conversation that somehow lasted for hours. Maybe they remember the way you looked at them when you were genuinely happy to see them. These moments may not have seemed important enough to remember forever, but now they are exactly the moments coming back. And this can create a realization that is difficult to ignore. They may not simply miss the person you were. They may miss the way they felt when they were with you. They may miss feeling understood. They may miss having someone who noticed the things they tried to hide. They may miss the familiarity that made them feel safe enough to be themselves. And once they recognize that, the question they were asked becomes much more emotional. If you were standing there right now, would they simply say hello? Or would they finally admit how much your presence meant to them? Perhaps they would want to tell you about all the times they thought about reaching out but stopped themselves. Perhaps they would tell you about moments when something reminded them of you unexpectedly. Maybe they would admit that there were days when they wondered what your life looked like now, whether you were happy, whether you had moved forward, and whether you ever thought about them too. They may have kept these questions private because admitting them would mean admitting that the connection still occupies some space inside them. And there is another layer here that may be even more difficult. Your soulmate may be realizing that while they have memories of who you were, they don't actually know who you have become. Time may have changed you. Your priorities may have changed. Your boundaries may have changed. The way you see relationships may have changed. And they may be wondering whether the person they imagine standing in front of them would still recognize the connection in the same way. That uncertainty can be powerful because it reminds them that they don't control the present anymore. They can remember the past perfectly and still have no idea what you feel today. They can remember how close you once were and still wonder whether that closeness could ever exist again. Perhaps that is why their imagined conversation keeps becoming more emotional. They are not only imagining what they would say, they are imagining how you would look at them while they said it. Would you smile? Would you stay quiet? Would you ask them why they waited? Would you tell them that you already moved on? Would you admit that you remembered too? They cannot know, and that unknown may be what makes the thought of seeing you so powerful. Because memories are safe. You can control them. You can replay them whenever you want and stop whenever they become uncomfortable. But a real conversation would be different. A real conversation would contain your reaction, your truth, your boundaries, and everything that happened while they were away. Your soulmate may be beginning to understand that if you ever stood in front of them again, they wouldn't simply be meeting the person they remember. They would be meeting the person you became after everything you experienced without them. And perhaps that is what makes their imagined words so difficult to choose. They may have 100 things they want to explain, but underneath all of them is one emotional truth they cannot escape. They are beginning to realize that losing your presence taught them what your presence actually meant. And once that realization settles in, they may start confronting the possibility that the conversation they have imagined so many times could go in a direction they never prepared for, because they may finally have to face what you would say back. There is one part of this situation your soulmate may be thinking about more than anything else now. What would happen if you actually stood in front of them and they had to hear your side of everything? Until now, they could imagine the conversation however they wanted. They could picture themselves saying the perfect words, explaining their choices, apologizing for what happened, or finally admitting what they felt. But the moment they imagine you standing there, the fantasy becomes much more complicated because you would have your own truth. You would have your own memories, your own unanswered questions, and your own version of everything that happened between you. And your soulmate may be realizing that they cannot control what you would say. Perhaps that is why the thought of seeing you again creates such a strange mixture of hope and nervousness inside them. They may want to know whether you still care, but at the same time, they may be afraid that you no longer feel the same way. They may wonder whether you would welcome them with warmth, or simply look at them with the calmness of someone who has already made peace with the past. That possibility can be difficult to face, especially if they once believed they would always have access to the version of you who cared deeply about what they thought. Time may have changed that. You may still remember them, but remembering someone does not mean waiting for them. You may still care, but caring does not mean accepting the same circumstances again. And your soulmate may be beginning to understand that distinction now. Perhaps they have spent time imagining what they would say, but suddenly another question has become louder. What if they ask me why I waited so long? That question can bring every unfinished moment back to the surface. They may remember opportunities they had to communicate, moments when they could have been more honest, and times when they chose silence because it felt easier than vulnerability. They may remember thinking there would always be another chance to explain themselves. But now, imagining you standing there, they may realize that time has consequences. You have lived through everything that happened after the connection changed. You have experienced your own growth, your own struggles, your own discoveries, and perhaps your own healing. They don't know exactly who would be standing in front of them anymore, and that uncertainty may be the very thing making them hesitate. Imagine returning to a place you once knew perfectly after being away for years. The building may still be there, but you don't know whether the rooms are arranged the same way, whether the doors still open, or whether the person you remember still lives there. That may be how your soulmate feels about the possibility of seeing you again. They recognize the memory of you, but they don't know the present version of you. They may wonder whether you would still understand them, whether you would still listen, or whether you would simply realize that you have become someone who no longer needs the answers they once desperately wanted. And perhaps the most emotional possibility is that you might not react the way they secretly hope. You might not cry. You might not become overwhelmed. You might not immediately ask them to stay. You might simply listen. And sometimes calmness can say more than anger ever could. If they saw that you were peaceful, confident, and no longer trapped inside the uncertainty of the past, they might realize just how much time has changed the balance between you. They may have imagined themselves returning with explanations, but suddenly they would have to earn the right to be heard. They may have imagined that their words would automatically reopen the connection, but now they may understand that your heart is not a door they can simply walk through whenever they are ready. This doesn't necessarily mean the connection is over. It means that your soulmate may finally be recognizing that you have your own choice in what happens next. And that realization could be why the question affected them so strongly. Someone asked what they would say if you were standing in front of them, but inside their mind, the question may have transformed into something much bigger. Would they still want to hear me? That is a very different question. It carries vulnerability because it requires them to consider that they may no longer have the emotional certainty they once had. They can prepare their apology. They can remember their explanation. They can imagine telling you how much you meant to them, but they cannot prepare your response. And perhaps that is exactly where their deepest feelings are being exposed. Because if they truly had nothing left to say, they wouldn't need to imagine the conversation at all. The fact that the question stayed with them may suggest that there are still emotions they haven't completely organized, memories they haven't completely released, and words they haven't completely accepted as unsaid. And now they may be wondering whether, if you really were standing there, they would finally have the courage to stop protecting themselves and simply tell you the truth. And now we come to the part of the question that may stay with your soulmate long after the conversation has ended, because eventually they may realize that if you were truly standing in front of them, they would not need a perfect speech. They would probably need honesty, all the explanations they have rehearsed in their mind, all the things they imagine saying one day, and all the memories they have carried quietly may suddenly feel less important than one simple truth. You mattered to them more than they allowed themselves to show. Perhaps they would look at you for a moment before speaking, because seeing you in reality would be completely different from imagining you from a distance. They may remember the person you were, but at the same time, they would be seeing the person you have become, and that could make every word feel heavier. Maybe the first thing they would want to say is that they never completely forgot you. Not because every day has been consumed by thoughts of the past, but because certain memories never lost their meaning. There may have been random moments when something reminded them of you, a familiar place, a particular song, a phrase someone used, or even a small habit they suddenly recognized in another person. They may have continued living their life, but somewhere beneath everything else, the memory of you remained. And if you were standing there, they might finally admit that. They might tell you that there were things they wanted to say much earlier, but didn't know how to say them without exposing parts of themselves they weren't ready to face. They might admit that fear, pride, confusion, or timing influenced decisions they now see differently. Perhaps they would apologize, not because an apology can rewrite the past, but because they finally understand that some things deserve to be acknowledged. They may tell you that they wish they had listened more carefully, communicated more honestly, or recognized the value of certain moments while they were still happening. But beneath the apology could be something even more vulnerable. I wondered about you. They may have wondered whether you were happy, whether you had moved forward, whether you ever remembered them, and whether the connection meant as much to you as it did to them. They may have wanted to reach out but stopped themselves because they didn't know what they would find on the other side. Perhaps they feared rejection. Perhaps they feared discovering that you had completely moved on. Or perhaps they feared that hearing your voice again would bring back emotions they had worked hard to keep under control. And that is why the question someone asked them may have been so powerful. It forced them to imagine a moment they had kept safely inside their mind and suddenly made it real enough to confront. If you were standing there, they couldn't hide behind silence anymore. They couldn't tell themselves that there was still plenty of time. They would have to look at you and decide whether the truth mattered more than their fear. Maybe they would say, "I hope you're doing well." Maybe they would ask how your life has been. Maybe they would simply stand there for a moment because the words they thought they had prepared would disappear when reality finally replaced imagination. Sometimes the deepest emotions don't begin with dramatic declarations. Sometimes they begin with a quiet look and a sentence as simple as, "I missed you," and perhaps that would be their truth. Not necessarily a promise about the future, not necessarily a demand for another chance, but an acknowledgement that your absence created a space they noticed. They may realize that missing someone doesn't automatically mean the past should be recreated. It simply means that person left an impact that time couldn't completely erase. And perhaps this is what your soulmate is finally beginning to understand. If you were standing in front of them right now, they wouldn't be speaking to the memory of you. They would be speaking to the person who survived everything that happened afterward. They would have to meet your growth, your boundaries, your new perspective, and the possibility that you no longer need the answers they once had the power to withhold. That may be the most humbling part for them. They can finally say what they wanted to say, but they cannot demand that you respond the way they hope. They can tell you that you mattered, but they cannot decide what that information means to you now. They can admit they were wrong about certain things, but they cannot undo the moments when you needed them and they weren't there. And perhaps that is exactly what makes their imagined conversation so emotional. For the first time, they may be understanding that love is not only about having something to say. It is also about being brave enough to accept whatever the other person says in return. So if someone recently asked your soulmate what they would say if you were standing in front of them, perhaps their answer was never really about finding the perfect words. It was about confronting everything those words represent. The memories, the silence, the moments they wish they had handled differently, the feelings they never explained. And the realization that, despite everything that happened, some part of them still wonders what it would feel like to look into your eyes and finally tell you the truth without hiding behind distance. Maybe they would say they are sorry, and maybe they would say they remember. Maybe they would say they still care. Maybe they would simply say your name and let everything else follow naturally. But beneath all of those possibilities may be one simple message they have carried longer than they realized. If you were standing in front of me right now, I would finally want you to know that you mattered to me, and perhaps you always mattered more than I knew how to say.